Okay, so we're going to look at the theme of cruelty in Of Mice and Men today. First of all, I just want you to think of some different forms of cruelty. So I've jotted down the idea of prejudice and obviously discrimination based on race, gender, economic status, age, disability. As I say that, you're probably thinking of the characters that you could then write about. I think we could also look at the abuse of power. So we could look at the use of threat, whether that's in the form of physical intimidation in terms of physical violence, or threats of economic consequences in the form of losing your job, or exploiting the vulnerability of others. And I think they're all examples of cruelty. Obviously, there's going to be a lot of overlap here between I've got 5 bullet points, haven't I, on this page. There's going to be a lot of overlap because obviously this abuse of power, it's evident in discrimination and it's evident in the racism and the sexism and so on. So I'm not saying these are completely different. I'm just trying to look at the different aspects of cruelty or types of cruelty that we could look at. I think we could also look at the impact of cruelty. And so one of the things I think is quite interesting in Of Mice and Men is that abusive behavior kind of becomes a default. It's represented as being instinctive. That there's almost a sense that it's so common within society that when people have the opportunity, that's what they do, that they abuse, that they bully, that they seek to exert power over someone else and to abuse their position of power when they have the opportunity. I think it's you can see it in people's body language and in their physical movements. I think it's evident in people's resignation and their submission, that they give up at times. I think you can see it in neglect and in restrictions and constraints. I think I'm thinking of Curly's wife there, in terms of being trapped in this dysfunctional relationship with her husband, with Curly, but also in terms of the segregation and the restrictions and the constraints under which Crooks lives, that he's not allowed in the bunkhouse with the other men because he's black and so on. The impact of cruelty, what else is there? Well, I think a lot of people feel fear in Of Mice and Men. Candy is very afraid of what old age will bring him. Crooks is justifiably very afraid of Curly's wife and the threats that she issues. George and Lenny are afraid of losing their jobs. There's a lot of fear going around, and I think that's the impact of cruelty. That's the consequence of it all. I think the cruelty that we witness in the world of Mice and Men, which remember is like a sort of microcosm of 1930s America, a little mini representation of what's happening on a bigger scale. I think that cruelty leads to a very rigid hierarchy. It's like everyone has their place and they know their place and they're determined not to give it up in terms of their status and power and control over others. So the control and power for the abuser, that's the result of the cruelty. People seek to be cruel in order to establish power over others. And of course it also leads to dreams and escapism, doesn't it? So the reason why people dream of a better life, the reason why they read the Western magazines that ranch men love to read and scoff at and secretly believe, the reason why they maybe dream of being the Dark Rider, the reason why they dream of owning a bit of land to call their own, the dream of being included and accepted, the reason for all those dreams and plans and forms of escapism is because of the cruelty that they experience on a day-to-day basis. The next thing I think we could look at is how cruelty is manifested through speech, through actions and behavior and body language and physical movement. And then also I think look at what's the reaction to this cruelty, and what's the opposite of it? How is it counteracted? Because not everything in Of Mice and Men is bleak and negative and pessimistic. I know a lot of it is, but I think there's also an element of optimism and positivity about the novel in lots of ways. You might miss those because in a way it seems so bleak and so full of death and disappointment and disillusionment, but actually this cruelty that we've been talking about here is counteracted, I think, by the human instinct to befriend and to seek companionship and to protect. And I think you see that most probably in George and Slim, but also in others. And I think there are characters that have integrity, who display compassion and kindness and who afford others a degree of dignity. And so that's the opposite of the cruelty that we see, and worth exploring. Okay, so let's start looking at prejudice and discrimination then. I'm not going to deal with this in specific terms in relation to the characters yet. We'll come on to that a little bit later. But at the moment, I kind of think, well, let's look at it in terms of the contextual factors that you could bring in. Because remember, for the Edexcel IGCSE, the context stuff is half the marks. So I'm just going to focus on context at the moment. Okay. In relation to race, then, you could look at segregation and the Jim Crow laws and the Ku Klux Klan and lynching. Curly's wife specifically mentions that, doesn't she? And I've just put a few little snippets of quotes from different websites underneath some of these that could maybe enable you to talk about this contextual stuff in a little bit more detail than you might otherwise would. Try not to just gloss over things and just say, oh, there was racism in 1930s America. Try to be that little bit more specific if you can. So I've just picked something from the BBC Bitesize website there, and it says, by the end of 1932, 50% of black Americans were unemployed. In some cities in the northern states, white people called for black people to be fired from their jobs due to unemployment in the white communities. African Americans received less aid than their white counterparts and were sometimes not even allowed to use charity soup kitchens. And so I know to some extent, Crook seems to have a reasonably stable job, but on the other hand, by looking at this contextual background here, we're looking at how precarious his position was, really, and the lack of rights and the discrimination that black people experienced in 1930s America. So in terms of cruelty, obviously this discrimination is evidence of that, isn't it? In relation to gender, we'd focus on Curly's wife, but also the prostitutes. And we could look at limited opportunities for women, limited independence, the dysfunctional marriage that Curly's wife is trapped in, the idea that the roles that women represent within the novel are stereotypically domestic or sexualized roles, that Curly's wife's dream, there's a lot of irony here, that what she dreams of is becoming a movie star. And so therefore, actually, even her dream involves becoming part of an industry controlled by men. So even her escape doesn't really involve an escape from patriarchal control. It involves just moving from one form of patriarchal control to another, doesn't it? And I've just got a little quote from The Guardian there. You can look at that whole article. It's quite a recent one. It's quite interesting if you wanted to. But the quote says, from the earliest days of Hollywood, women were stage managed and manipulated by older men in powerful positions. In the 1930s, the business was being run by a group of male executives, many of whom obsessively controlled the films they produced and the women who starred in them. That could be a good little quote from The Guardian to take an extract from to maybe use in an essay if you're writing about women and Curly's wife within the novel. In terms of economic status, of course, people are the victims of discrimination as well, aren't they, as migrant workers. And this is where you probably want to mention the 1929 Wall Street crash and migrant and itinerant workers, the Dust Bowl, the Great Depression, the idea of them leading this transient lifestyle, nothing's permanent, no job security. Again, I just got a little bit from the BBC Bitesize website there. At the peak of the Great Depression, between 13 million and 15 million people in the USA were unemployed. Industrial production in the country dropped by almost half. Many people across America suffered from poverty, hunger and disease as a result of the Depression. Benefits, really, it's certainly in the first part of the 30s, did not exist in America at the time. So people who lost their jobs could also lose their homes and found it very difficult to buy food. Okay, another couple of aspects of prejudice and discrimination and therefore cruelty that we could look at. In terms of age, in 1935 there was the Social Security Act, which provided some kind of security for people in their old age, but agricultural workers were excluded. Just got a little quote from Wikipedia there that you could use. And so obviously Candy is facing financial insecurity in his old age if he doesn't manage to tap into and become part of George and Lenny's dream. In relation to disability, remember there's quite a few examples of disability, aren't there? Obviously, Candy has lost his hand. Crooks has this crooked back, doesn't he? And then Lenny, of course, as well, has learning disabilities, doesn't he? And this is a quote from a book from the 1930s. And it says, in 1914, Harry Laughlin published a model eugenical sterilisation law that proposed to authorise sterilisation of the socially inadequate, people supported in institutions or maintained wholly or in part by public expense. The law encompassed the feeble-minded, was the term they were using, insane, criminalistic, epileptic, inebriate, diseased, blind, deaf, deformed, and dependent, including orphans, ne'er-do-wells, tramps, the homeless, and paupers, is the quote. By the time the model law was published in 1914, 12 states had enacted sterilisation laws. So in terms of how, disabled people with disabilities, whether they might be learning difficulties, mental disabilities or physical ones, that gives you some kind of picture as to how these people were treated very much as second-class citizens. Okay, let's move on to thinking about the abuse of power then. Now, for each of these, I'm only just going to tap into a couple of examples, but these are by no means the only examples that you can look at. So here I'm going to just talk to you briefly about Curly and George, but you could look at so many other examples to do with these characters and others. Okay, so do your own thinking and your own research and your own notes here. These are just a couple of examples that you could use. So for the abuse of power, we're talking about the use of threat, whether that's physical intimidation or the economic consequences and exploiting the vulnerability of others. Well, Curly, remember when he's first described, it says, and he meets George and Lenny, it says his arms gradually bent at the elbows and his hands closed into fists. He's got this curly hair and he's almost like coiled like a spring, isn't he? Such a contrast to Slim. So Curly attains power through intimidation, doesn't he? He basically is threatening to punch anyone who doesn't do what he says and give him the respect that he demands. And such a contrast to Slim. Slim has power and status through respect. Curly attains it through fear, doesn't he? Whether that's physical intimidation or through the threat of telling his old man something and getting one of the workers canned, whether that's George and Lenny or whoever. Okay, so it's kind of, he has power by association because he's the boss's son, doesn't he? The incident on page 66 is worth looking at as well, where, I don't know if you remember, but George tells Lenny to jump into the Sacramento River. He's relaying this story that happened in the past, and he was with a bunch of friends, and he said to Lenny to jump in the river, and Lenny couldn't swim. George had to dive in to rescue him and so on. And George learns from that incident, doesn't he? And he says, well, I ain't done nothing like that no more. But he recognises the reason why he's sort of repentant and a bit apologetic about it is that he recognises that that was abusive, that he was exploiting Lenny's vulnerability. He was abusing his position of power over Lenny because he realises that Lenny would do whatever he told him to do. But it is an example of cruelty, isn't it? And he's exploiting Lenny because of his learning difficulties, isn't he? His learning disabilities. On the other hand, it also represents George as someone who's, yes, flawed, but also capable of change, capable of learning from his mistakes. Okay, the impact of cruelty then. And we can see this in so many ways, but let's just look briefly at crooks. I think it's interesting to deal with this idea of abusive behaviour becoming kind of default and instinctive within 1930s America, because everyone does it, so that's what everyone does. Even if you're a powerless, vulnerable individual like Crooks because of his race, when he has the opportunity, when Lenny goes into his room on Saturday night, the victim, Crooks, he's normally the victim, isn't he? He becomes the bully, in effect, doesn't he, for a short time. He finds himself briefly, maybe for the only time ever in his life, he finds himself in a position where he can exploit someone else's vulnerability, doesn't he? And I think Steinbeck is kind of suggesting that the tendency to do this has become ingrained in society, that everyone is abusive, and so even the weakest, when they have the opportunity to do so, they seize that opportunity to rise above someone else and establish their status over someone. And it's quite a disturbing line, isn't it, at the bottom of page 103, Whereas remember, Crooks is taunting Lenny, and he's saying, suppose George don't come back, just suppose he don't come back, what will you do then? Okay, and at that point it says, Crooks' face lighted with pleasure in his torture. It's quite unsettling, isn't it? It's quite an uncomfortable line, that one, because, you know, generally you view Crooks, you know, he's presented in quite a sympathetic light. You know, you have a lot of sympathy for him, don't you? And yet at that moment you think, wow, you're enjoying torturing Lenny. And it's quite disturbing, that. But I think what Steinbeck is saying is that, well, that's what the world is like. It is this harsh world where even the weakest, the most vulnerable, when they find themselves in a position to exploit their power over someone else, that's what they'll do. Yeah. In terms of body language and physical movements, this one I think is quite interesting, where it says, Crooks had retired into the terrible protective dignity. Crooks seemed to grow smaller. He pressed himself against the wall. And there's that sense of resignation as well, isn't there? If you remember at the end of chapter 4, when he realizes it was just a ridiculous dream, the idea of him coming in with George and Lenny and Candy and all this, he realizes after the way that Curly's wife has treated him that he will never be able to be part of this because of the racism of which he's the victim. And he says about Curly's wife, what she says is true. You know, he's resigned to the fact that he will never be able to escape this room at the end of the barn. He will always be treated like an animal with a pile of manure outside the window. He will never be able to escape that. He resigns himself to it. So the impact of Cruelty is this kind of resignation, this submission. Notice he kind of makes himself smaller, doesn't he? Because he doesn't want to be attacked verbally or physically. Yeah. And he has to, in that position, it's a genuine threat from Curly's wife, isn't it? When she says, I can get you strung up on a tree so easy it ain't even funny. You know, he has to submit to her power and authority over him as a white woman. How is it manifested then? How is cruelty manifested? Through speech and through actions and behavior, through body language, physical movement, and through description, or through speech. We can see that very much with the way that Curly's wife, I think, speaks to not just Crooks, but to Candy and to Lenny as well in chapter 4. She says, oh, Saturday night, everybody's out doing something. What am I doing? Standing here talking to a bunch of bindlestiffs, she says. An N and a dum-dum and a lousy old sheep. And so there, what she's doing, she's categorizing them. She's kind of placing them into sort of stereotypes, into slots, into categories. She's saying, you're all homeless. Okay, you're all these kind of homeless migrant workers. That's what the bindlestiffs means. And of course she uses the racial slur to refer to Crooks, and then the dum-dum is to refer to Lenny because of his learning disabilities, and the lousy old sheep is the ageism, isn't there? An ageist derogatory reference to refer to Candy. So she's saying, you're old, you're black, you've got learning disabilities, you're all homeless. She's using language to oppress them, to squash them down. Chapter 4 is all about this jostling for power, and so her cruelty to the others as a means of imposing and exerting her power over the others is demonstrated through speech, through language here, isn't it? Actions. Crooks is treated like an animal, isn't he? In terms of he has to sleep basically in the barn with the animals, doesn't he? What about the killing of Candy's dog? Look at the look at the way Candy is treated there. There's not really any consideration. There's no room for sentimentality. There's no room for empathizing really with Candy there, or taking his feelings and thoughts into consideration. It's just the dog smells, shoot it. There's an element of cruelty there, isn't there? What about the threat to lock Lenny up at the end? George says, "Well, do we have to go and find him and kill him? Can't we just kind of do something else?" And Slim says, what will they do? Even if Curly's going to want to shoot him, but even if he doesn't, what'll they do? They'll lock him up and strap him down and put him in a cage. Is that any good for him? So in terms of the way that Lenny, as someone with learning disabilities, is treated, can you see that's quite an interesting quote that you could use there? In terms of body language and physical movement, well, you could look at Curly's wife and the way that she treats Crooks in chapter 4. So it says, for a moment she stood over him as though waiting for him to move so that she could whip at him again. But Crooks sat perfectly still, his eyes averted, everything that might be hurt drawn in. It's that physical authority standing over him, taller than him, looking down at him, isn't there? And then finally, this is one that you might not have thought of. Look at how the description, this isn't even really in relation to any people or their actions. Look at how Steinbeck uses the description of life on the ranch to emphasize what a harsh, maybe cruel world it is. And look at the onomatopoeic use of the plosives there. Plosives are harsh sounds like p, b, d, t, g, k. Okay, look at this. This is from the bottom, I think, of page 51, and it says, the sound of approaching grain teams was louder. Thud of big hooves on hard ground, drag of brakes, and the jingle of trace chains. Look at the sounds there. What Steinbeck, I think, is doing is he's saying, listen to these harsh, hard sounds, because it's a harsh, hard world out there. It's a cruel, harsh, hard world. So can you see how you could use that? That could be quite an original point to make. Okay, how is it counteracted then, this cruelty, by this human instinct to befriend? Well, I think Slim and George is who you want to look at. And there's such a contrast, aren't they, to Carlson and Curly. Carlson and Curly, right at the end, they get the last 2 words of the novel, don't they, where they say they're looking at Slim and George because George has just shot his best friend and Slim is comforting him. And Carlson and Curly say, oh, what, you suppose he's eating them 2 guys? What's up with them? Oh, I don't get it. It's kind of almost laughable, isn't it? This kind of like complete incapacity to empathize with anyone. But Slim, he physically touches George. He sits down right next to him. He twitches George's elbow. There's not a huge amount of physical touch in the novel, is there? Apart from violence. Yeah? Either someone's breaking someone's neck or they're crushing their hand or they're... Do you know what I mean? Whereas here there's kind of genuine physical touch and intimacy and comfort, isn't there? Yeah? Look also at the way that Slim talks to Crooks. I think it's quite interesting. Look at page 77. He's one of the few people not to use a derogatory racial slur when he's referring to Crooks or about him. Okay, and he just says, hello, Crooks. And I just think, I know that might seem very, very simple, but I think it's kind of quite interesting. Look at the just very basic conversation that Slim and Crooks have there. And there's a degree of respect, a degree of dignity afforded to Crooks. Now, I'm not saying that, Slim is perfect and kind of like, represented as sort of the, guiltless, really, because he doesn't actually actively do anything to stop the segregation that Crooks is the victim of, for instance, does he? But at least he makes some kind of effort to just treat him as a human being, I think, and that might be worth commenting on there. Look at George as the protector of Lenny. Look back in chapter 1 where he says, you never drink water when it ain't running, Lenny. When Lenny's just scooping up this water from some ditch or wherever it is, from some pool. And George genuinely wants to protect him and make sure that he doesn't get ill, doesn't he? Look at Slim's response to the fight between Lenny and Curly. This is quite interesting. Look at how he treats Lenny and Curly and George. So Lenny and Curly and George, they're all in very different situations following this fight, aren't they? But notice Lenny is kind of, shaking with fear because of what he's done and, thinking, oh my goodness, what have I done now? Have I got into trouble? There's this bit where he actually says, it ain't your fault, okay, to Lenny. And then he says, in relation to Curly, it then says he rushes out the room and he goes and gets some water and it says he held it to Curly's lips. Yeah, so he says to Lenny, it's not your fault. He gives Curly some water. And then George says, well, Curly's old man can us now? And Slim solves the problem for him. And I think, this is really interesting how Slim treats these three very different people in very different circumstances here. He's decent and genuine and fair and actually kind and compassionate to all those people. Yeah, he might be critical as well. I'm not saying that because obviously he recognizes this is all Curly's fault and so on. Okay, but there's an element of compassion and dignity in the way that that Slim behaves at this point that's certainly not cruel. Okay, and I think it's maybe this, if we're looking at how is cruelty counteracted by people within the novel, I think we need to look at Slim and George.